In the quiet wilderness near Flagstaff, Arizona, the air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Jack Thompson, a former forest ranger, moved steadily through the dense trees, his boots crunching softly against the underbrush. His dark brown hair was starting to show flecks of gray, a reminder of the years he had spent protecting the forests from poachers and illegal activities. It had been a few months since he'd retired, but the silence of nature still called to him, pulling him back to a time when life felt simpler, more meaningful. But retirement hadn't filled the void in his heart. He had left behind the life of protecting the land, and although he found solace in the stillness of the forest, something deep inside him felt empty. The absence of purpose was unsettling. He had thought about finding another way to contribute, but for now, he spent his days patrolling the area, checking on the wildlife, and maintaining the solitude that he had grown to appreciate. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, casting the sky in hues of purple and orange, Jack heard a sound unlike any he had encountered before. It was a soft but sharp cry, rising above the normal sounds of the forest, a sound filled with distress and panic. He stopped, listening intently. It didn't take long for him to realize it was coming from a spot deep in the forest, near an area he rarely ventured into. His curiosity piqued. Jack followed the sound, pushing through thick undergrowth and branches, his heart pounding with a mix of worry and anticipation. With each step, the cry grew louder, and as he approached the source, he began to understand the urgency of the situation. He reached a clearing, and what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. At the center of the clearing, a young lynx cub was struggling to keep its head above the water of a flooded creek. Its little body was barely able to hold onto the slick rocks, and it was slowly being dragged downstream by the force of the current. Jack knew immediately that the cub was in danger, but it wasn't just the cub he was concerned about. The cub's mother, a fierce and protective lynx known as Samantha, was nowhere to be seen. As Jack rushed forward to the water's edge, his heart dropped. The sight of the cub in such a vulnerable state was painful to witness. But something else caught his attention. There, at the far edge of the clearing, a large lynx was trapped. The poor animal's front paw was caught in an illegal poaching trap, and its eyes were wide with fear and agony. It was Samantha, the mother of the cub. In an instant, Jack understood the situation. Samantha had been caught in the trap while trying to protect her cub. She couldn't get free, and the stress of the situation had left her unable to help her child. The cub was alone, struggling in the water, and Samantha was helpless, unable to save her young one. With no time to waste, Jack made a decision. He couldn't just let this happen. The cub needed to be saved, and Samantha needed to be freed. Jack carefully approached the creek. Surveying the situation, he could see the terror in the cub's eyes, its small body growing weaker with each attempt to swim. Jack wasn't sure how much longer it could last in the cold water. But before he could act, the noise of branches snapping and low, hushed voices carried through the trees. Jack froze, realizing that the poachers were returning to the scene. The danger had just escalated. Not only was the cub and its mother in immediate peril, but Jack could now be in danger himself. He quickly assessed the situation. The cub was still struggling in the water, and Samantha was caught in the trap, helpless. There was no time to waste. Jack knew that confronting the poachers head-on would be risky, but leaving the animals to their fate wasn't an option. He crouched low, hiding in the underbrush as he watched two men appear from the shadows. Dressed in tattered clothing, with hunting rifles slung over their shoulders, they were carrying traps and chains, their voices low but menacing. They were laughing, too, clearly confident that they could take whatever they wanted from the forest. Jack's fists clenched as he watched them approach the trapped lynx. His heart raced, and his instincts kicked in. He couldn't let these men take Samantha, or worse, kill her. But as the men moved closer, Jack knew he needed to think fast. He had to be strategic. With every ounce of his training, Jack calculated his next move. He needed to get the attention of the poachers without revealing himself, to create a distraction long enough to free Samantha and rescue the cub. With a swift motion, Jack picked up a small rock and threw it towards the bushes a few yards away. The sound of the rustling leaves caught the poachers' attention. Just as Jack had hoped, they froze, looking toward the noise. One of them whispered, "Did you hear that?" Jack held his breath, staying perfectly still. The poachers, suspicious but not yet certain, moved toward the sound. Now was his chance. Jack quickly moved toward Samantha, crouching down beside the trap. His heart pounded in his chest. But he knew what he had to do. He had to act quickly to save these animals. The rest of the day would unfold in a way that no one could have anticipated. With the poachers distracted by the noise from the bushes, Jack wasted no time. He scrambled forward, the cold air biting at his skin as he reached Samantha. The lynx mother was still struggling against the trap, her body trembling from both the pain and the stress of the situation. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also a sense of exhaustion, as if she had been fighting for hours. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. Jack had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. He wasn't just saving a life, he was protecting two beings who had no chance of defending themselves against these poachers. His mission was clear now. He would not let Samantha and her cub fall into the hands of these ruthless men. Carefully, Jack examined the trap that had ensnared Samantha's paw. It was an old model, the kind that was often used by illegal hunters to trap larger animals. The metal teeth of the trap were digging deep into her flesh, and Jack could see that she had already been struggling for some time. It would take all of his strength and skill to free her without causing further injury. Samantha let out a low, guttural growl as Jack approached. She was clearly on edge, but she seemed to recognize that he wasn't a threat. Jack spoke to her in a calm, soothing voice. "It's okay, girl, I'm here to help," he whispered, hoping the sound of his voice would offer some comfort. With one hand, Jack carefully held her paw in place, trying to ease her pain. With his other hand, he worked quickly to release the metal jaws of the trap. His fingers were numb from the cold, but he didn't dare stop. The poachers were close, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to hurt Samantha if they saw her escape. As the trap finally opened with a loud click, Samantha let out a sharp hiss and yanked her paw free. She staggered back, her breathing heavy, but she didn't run. Jack could see that she was still disoriented, but she was free. He had done it, but there was no time to celebrate. Jack quickly turned his attention to the cub, who was still struggling in the water. The poor creature had lost its fight against the current and was now floating helplessly, its small body bobbing up and down in the water. Jack glanced back at Samantha, who was watching him with a protective gaze, and knew that he had to act fast. As he moved toward the water's edge, he could hear the voices of the poachers growing louder. They were coming back. Jack cursed under his breath but didn't slow down. He had to get the cub to safety, and he had to do it before the poachers returned. He waded into the cold water, feeling the chill of the creek as it seeped into his boots. The water was deep in places, but Jack knew he had to move quickly. His eyes locked on the cub, which was barely moving now, its small head just above the surface of the water. With a steady hand, Jack reached out and pulled the cub toward him, cradling its fragile body in his arms. The cub didn't fight him. Instead, it nuzzled into his chest. Shivering from the cold and fear, Jack held it tightly, careful not to drop it as he waded back toward the shore. As he emerged from the water, he glanced over his shoulder to see that Samantha had moved closer. Watching intently, the poachers were still not far off. Jack knew he didn't have much time. He could hear their footsteps approaching, the sound of their heavy boots crunching through the dry leaves. He quickly darted behind a thick cluster of trees, hiding with the cub in his arms. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't find him. The voices of the poachers grew louder as they reached the clearing. Jack could see them through the dense underbrush, still oblivious to his presence. They were laughing, unaware that their prey was slipping right through their fingers. One of the men pointed toward the spot where Samantha had been trapped earlier. "Where did it go?" one of the poachers muttered, clearly frustrated. It couldn't have gone far. Jack stayed perfectly still, hoping they wouldn't look in his direction. His heart was racing, his breath shallow, but he couldn't afford to make a sound. The cub, now securely tucked in his arms, whimpered softly, and Jack quickly shushed it, holding it closer to his chest to keep it calm. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, and finally, the poachers seemed to lose interest. They walked off in the opposite direction, their voices fading into the distance. Jack let out a long breath of relief, but he didn't relax. He knew this wasn't over. They might come back, and he couldn't take that risk. Carefully, Jack stood up, holding the cub in his arms as he motioned to Samantha. "It's safe now. Let's get you both out of here," he whispered, though he knew Samantha couldn't understand him. The lynx mother stepped out of the shadows, her eyes still wary, but her movements were more assured now. She glanced at Jack, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. In that moment, Jack felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them. He had saved her life, and in return, she had kept him safe from the poachers. With the cub still in his arms and Samantha at his side, Jack made his way through the dense trees, careful to cover his tracks. He couldn't afford to be followed. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jack felt a surge of pride and relief. He had saved 2 lives that day, and in a way, they had all saved each other. The journey back to Flagstaff was long, but Jack was determined. The bond between him and the wild had been restored, and it was stronger than ever. As Jack and the lynx mother, Samantha, along with her cub, made their way through the dense underbrush near Flagstaff, the weight of the day's events settled in. The urgency in Jack's steps was tempered by a quiet understanding that they were far from safe. He had managed to free Samantha, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Samantha's sharp senses had detected the danger long before he did, and Jack knew that if the poachers hadn't found them yet, it was only a matter of time before they did. His heart was still pounding, his thoughts racing, but he was determined to keep going. The trek through the forest was taxing. The once clear path was now obscured by fallen branches and dense foliage. Jack moved forward carefully, taking care not to make any sound, while still trying to keep the small family of wildcats safe. The cub, still shivering from the cold water, had clung to Samantha, and the mother was now walking a little faster. As though sensing that they needed to move quickly, Jack glanced down at the cub in his arms, still cradled tightly against his chest. He could feel the little creature's heartbeat, fast and fragile, and he couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for them. Was this just a temporary bond, a fleeting moment of rescue, or would Samantha and her cub find a new home with him? And more importantly, would they be safe from the poachers who were still lurking in the shadows? "Don't worry, little one," Jack whispered softly, his voice a comforting murmur that only the cub could hear. "We'll get you somewhere safe." Samantha's eyes darted nervously as she led the way, her senses on high alert. She knew the forest better than anyone, and Jack trusted her instincts. They had to get back to his cabin at the edge of Flagstaff, far from the prying eyes of the poachers. Samantha had made her bond with Jack clear earlier. Her trust in him was unspoken but solid. He had saved her cub and her life. Now it was time for Jack to make sure that they had a future. As they approached the outskirts of Flagstaff, the faint outline of Jack's cabin came into view. It was small, surrounded by tall trees, and isolated from the rest of the town. Jack had always preferred solitude, and it seemed like the perfect place for Samantha and her cub to heal, away from the dangers of the world. But even with the safety of his home in sight, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, like it was holding its breath, and he couldn't help but feel as though they were being watched. "Just a little longer," Jack muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He was exhausted, his muscles aching from the strain of carrying the cub, but he pushed on, driven by the need to get them to safety. As they neared the cabin, Samantha paused, her ears perked up, and she froze, her sharp gaze scanning the area around them. Jack stopped too, instinctively following her lead. He didn't hear anything at first, but soon, the sound of footsteps crunching in the dry leaves reached his ears. The poachers were back. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes. He didn't want to take any chances, but he had to be sure. He carefully set the cub down in a small, hidden crevice of the trees and motioned for Samantha to stay quiet. The mother lynx, despite her earlier agitation, now seemed to understand what needed to be done. She remained still, her eyes locked on Jack as she crouched low to the ground. Waiting, the footsteps grew louder. Jack felt his pulse race, but he couldn't afford to panic. If the poachers found them now, they would be in even greater danger. Jack pressed his back against the rough bark of a tree. Listening closely, he could make out the voices of the poachers, who were speaking in low, gruff tones, unaware of the animals in hiding just a few yards away. "We missed them by a hair," one of the poachers grumbled, clearly frustrated. "That man is quick, but no matter, we'll get them sooner or later." Jack's stomach churned. He could hear the contempt in their voices, the blatant disregard they had for the creatures of the forest. He tightened his grip on the small knife he kept at his side, though he knew it wouldn't do much against men armed with rifles. Still, he wasn't about to let them take Samantha and her cub. As the poachers passed by, oblivious to Jack and the animals hidden in the trees, Jack breathed a sigh of relief. But it was only momentary. He knew that they wouldn't be gone for long, and that time was running out. They had to move now. With quiet urgency, Jack motioned for Samantha to follow him. He could tell the lynx mother was as anxious as he was to get back to the cabin. But they couldn't afford to be seen. He took a few careful steps forward, keeping an eye on the poachers as they disappeared into the woods. When the last of their footsteps faded, Jack hurried toward the cabin. His cabin was just a few hundred yards away, and every step felt like a mile. His heart was pounding, not from exhaustion but from the knowledge that they weren't completely out of danger yet. As they approached the cabin, Jack allowed himself one last glance over his shoulder. The poachers were still nowhere in sight, but Jack knew that wouldn't last long. With Samantha and her cub now safely inside the cabin, Jack locked the door behind him, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he allowed himself to breathe. They were safe, for now. As he sat down by the fire, his mind raced. What would happen next? Would Samantha and her cub stay here? Would they find peace after everything that had happened? But for now, Jack was content to simply hold them close, knowing that he had done what needed to be done. In the silence of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, and the soft sound of Samantha and her cub purring by his side, Jack finally allowed himself to relax. If only for a moment. He had saved them, and in return, they had saved him. The days following the narrow escape from the poachers were filled with a quiet kind of peace. Jack had returned to his usual routines in his small cabin on the outskirts of Flagstaff. But now with the comforting presence of Samantha and her cub, Luna, the cabin that once felt too empty was now alive with the subtle sounds of the wild. The occasional rustle of Samantha's tail swishing as she moved, the soft purring of Luna, and the distant hoots of owls outside provided a constant reminder that the bond they shared was deeper than simple survival. It was a shared understanding of the hardships each of them had endured. Jack would often find himself staring at the fire late into the night, the crackling warmth from the hearth making the shadows on the walls dance. The journey to safety had been long and hard, but Samantha and Luna seemed to be settling in. It was clear to Jack that the lynx mother had already started to trust him more than she ever had before. She no longer lurked at the edges of the cabin, eyes always alert. Instead, she would rest by the fire, her body relaxed, though still aware of her surroundings, as if the calmness in Jack's home had allowed her to finally let down her guard. Luna, on the other hand, was a curious little creature. Her wide, innocent eyes followed Jack everywhere he went. Each day, Jack would venture out to tend to his traps, to hunt, or gather firewood. At first, Samantha would follow him, always keeping a safe distance, while Luna would explore the surrounding area, always staying close to the cabin. But as the days passed, the cub began to exhibit more confidence, darting from one tree to the next, practicing her movements, sharpening her instincts. Jack would smile to himself at how quickly Luna had adapted. But despite the tranquility that had settled into their lives, Jack knew the lurking danger wasn't far behind. Samantha still kept a watchful eye on the woods, as if anticipating another threat to her and Luna. Though the poachers had gone, Jack could feel the shadow of their intentions. The same rage that had fueled his rescue efforts still simmered inside him whenever he thought of the men who had wanted to hurt these beautiful creatures. One crisp morning, as Jack and Samantha walked the perimeter of the cabin, something caught Samantha's attention. Her posture stiffened, and her ears twitched. Jack felt it too. He paused, his breath held in the cold air. The forest had grown silent, as though the wind itself had stopped moving. Then, just as quickly as it had gone quiet, the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow reached Jack's ears. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something, approaching. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be the poachers again? Or was it something else? His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, but he knew he would need more than that if things escalated. Samantha's gaze met his, and without a word, she began to move with stealth through the trees, her body low to the ground, her instincts kicking in. Jack followed closely, trying to make as little noise as possible. They crept toward the edge of the forest, hiding behind the thick trunks of the pines, their eyes scanning the clearing ahead. And then, through the dense underbrush, Jack saw them, 3 figures. Rough-looking men, carrying rifles and ropes slung over their shoulders. Their clothes were ragged, their faces weathered, but what caught Jack's attention was the familiar sight of a trap. A snare positioned near the trees. They were setting up again. His blood ran cold. The poachers hadn't given up. They were trying to reclaim their hold on this territory, determined to capture anything they could. Jack knew that if they succeeded in capturing another animal, it could mean the end of Samantha and Luna's future. The thought of that made him burn with fury. But he also knew they couldn't face these men head-on. Jack's mind raced as he thought of a plan. He glanced at Samantha, who was already preparing herself for action, her body taut with readiness. Then, without a moment's hesitation, Jack made his move. He reached into his pack, pulling out a handful of pebbles. With a swift, practiced motion, he threw them toward a distant bush, sending a cascade of noise into the air. The poachers immediately turned, distracted by the noise. As they moved toward the sound, Jack grabbed Samantha and Luna, guiding them silently away from the clearing. They had to get to higher ground, where the poachers couldn't see them. The lynx mother and cub followed him without hesitation, trusting him completely now. The poachers, frustrated by the failed distraction, turned back to the clearing, only to realize that Jack and his charges were gone. They had lost their trail, and it was only a matter of time before they would give up and move on. But for Jack, the danger had passed, for now. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking the forest, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. He sat down on a boulder, breathing heavily, and glanced at Samantha and Luna, who were now safe on the other side of the ridge. Jack had done it. He had saved them once again. That night, as Jack sat by the fire with Samantha and Luna, the flickering light casting soft shadows across their faces, he reflected on how far they had come. He had set out on this journey to protect them, but it had turned into something more, a bond forged in the fires of survival and mutual respect. And as he gazed into the fire, he knew that no matter what came next, he would face it alongside Samantha and Luna. Together, they had survived the worst, and together, they would face whatever the future held. The wild was still full of dangers, but for now, Jack knew one thing for sure: he was no longer alone. He had found his family in the most unexpected of places. Flagstaff, with its quiet forests and towering pines, had become their sanctuary, and as Jack sat back and listened to the calm, steady purrs of Luna and the contented sigh of Samantha, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of a new chapter for them all.